Here is our sit-down interview with Joel Skousen, editor of World Affairs Brief. Skousen was the chairman of the Conservative National Committee in the 1980s and the executive editor of Conservative Digest. Skousen talks about the hidden power structure who control the politicians of both parties from behind the scenes, the nature of the manipulated press, the reality behind the Tea Party, and the ongoing conspiracy to complete a one-world dictatorship.
I'm Joel Skousen, editor of World Affairs Brief. I'm a political scientist by training, was the former chairman of the Conservative National Committee during the Reagan administration, and have been active ever since in trying to alert people to what's going on in the world. Today, I'd like to start off by talking about the reasons that a dialectic philosophy of conflict is used by the opposition, or at least the opposition to liberty. I think this is very important to understand that there is real systematic good and evil in the world. It isn't just happenstance that someone turns out to be evil. There is systematic evil in the world, meaning it's self-generating, it continues, it picks people to follow along. Goodness, in contrast, is not that way. We try to raise good children, but we essentially allow people to follow the path that they want to follow. But evil isn't that way. Evil wants to progenitor, and it uses certain techniques to do this, and one of them is the dialectic. The dialectic is where you create crises in order to induce good people to do things or accept things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. The reason for this, that you need to deceive people, and in all of this, we're talking about the Tea Party deception, we're talking about the deception of political parties. We need to understand that deception is something that has always been with us in the world and always will because of this systematic battle between good and evil. But there is a systematic good as well, and that is the role of conscience in people. And it's because certain people can sense that something's wrong, that evil has to use deception and dialectic in order to get people to do things in spite of conscience, in spite of sensing that something's wrong. In essence, when you create a big enough crisis, there's a feeling of panic. We have no choice. We have no power to resist. There's this feeling of futility. So even though people can sense what's right in conscience, they don't act according to it, or they follow along the path of least resistance because of the severity of the crisis. That's the reason why evil uses crises to change the world. When I was growing up, I was first exposed to the writings of my uncle, W. Cleon Skousen, who wrote The Naked Communist. The most dramatic story in that book, and I still highly recommend it today. The most highly prized story in that book is the fall of China to Mao Zedong. And it was clearly outlined in the book how our own State Department, in league with George Catlett Marshall, who was head of our armed forces during World War II, actually set about to destroy the power of Chiang Kai-shek to win the battles against Mao Zedong. They set him up for failure. They withdraw armed support from him so that he basically could not win against Mao. And I thought to myself, what's going on here? Are these communists in our government? Was Catlett Marshall, or was George Marshall a communist? Were the State Department people communist? So as I began to research this and talk to my uncle about it, I found out that they were not communists. There were communists in the State Department, especially the second floor, which had to do with foreign policy, did have some communists in it. And then there was the story of Alger Hiss, who was accused of being a communist. In fact, he did join the Communist Party. But there was something strange about Alger Hiss in that he was highly protected by the establishment, those that weren't communists. Whittaker Chambers is the one who outed Alger Hiss. Whittaker Chambers was a dedicated ideological Marxist communist. He repented of that, changed, decided to tell all. He was very, very honest. He was vilified for his honesty, and he's the one who named Alger Hiss. But the establishment came out for years. I mean, Alger Hiss went to prison eventually on perjury. The establishment never gave up on Alger Hiss. They always continued to support him. And one day a light came on in my mind, and I realized I think Alger Hiss was in fact a globalist. He's part of this broader conspiracy, was not a communist, but that in fact he joined the Communist Party to help facilitate Communist Party infiltration into the State Department, into the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, which is exactly what he did. But when he wrote the United Nations Charter, it became very clear this was more than just a communist, this was a globalist, using communism to facilitate the goals of globalism. And so when I finally had this new paradigm, this perspective, and this is something that no one else has ever written about, to my knowledge. Everyone in the conservative movement thinks that Alger Hiss was a communist. But it doesn't explain why the non-communists were defending him so vociferously. As I began to look historically at what was happening as nation after nation was falling to communism, later on, of course, they destroyed Batista of Cuba in the same way that they did of Mao Zedong in China. They pulled out military support. It was the second level of the State Department. We had planted reporters like Herbert Matthews in the New York Times, who would write these knifing, derogatory articles about Batista, and these articles about how Fidel Castro was this reformer, how he was a person who was the people's man. He did the same hatchet job on Mao Zedong. Later on, Drew Pearson carried on with Jack Anderson in the Washington merry-go-round. They were primarily responsible for bringing down Anastasio Somoza of Nicaragua, allowing the Sandinistas to come to power. Anastasio Somoza had his flaws, certainly. He was a strong man, but he was pro-Western, very much for free markets. He was clearly an ally of the West, and we destroyed him. Why? They wanted the communists to come to power. Because they were communists? I don't think so. I think it's because the globalist view is that we can use communism to break down the existing social order. We can use communism to create even more horrific crimes, and then we, the globalists, a moderate form of socialism that intertwines predatory capitalism, mercantilism with socialism, we can come into the rescue, save people from communism, and give them our version of the New World Order, which people will then tend to accept. And they would not accept were we not to have the horrors of communism to pave the way. So that's what I feel is the important thing to realize, is that communism, socialism, Fabian socialism, and there are tens of other variations of enemies to the free market are all promoted to one degree or another. In the same sense, the conspiracy has had the necessity of morphing into different organizations to be able to cover itself from discovery.